The wallet was the kind that didn't belong on a subway floor. Thick, dark cognac leather with hand-stitched edges, the kind of weight that meant something. Mara Voss found it wedged between the orange plastic seat and the wall of the C train at 7:52 on a Wednesday morning, half hidden under a discarded metro section in someone's forgotten umbrella. She almost didn't see it. She almost walked past it the way every other commuter had, eyes forward, earbuds in, the whole city performing its daily agreement not to notice anything inconvenient. But Mara had been raised by a woman who once drove 40 minutes to return $2 in wrong change to a gas station attendant, so she noticed, and she stopped, and she picked it up. She sat down with it in her lap and looked around the car. The woman to her left was asleep against the window. The man across from her was watching a video with subtitles. Nobody was patting their pockets in sudden alarm. Nobody was scanning the floor with that particular tight-jawed expression of a person who has just lost something that cannot be replaced. The train swayed and lurched into the next station and still nobody moved. Mara pressed her lips together and opened the wallet. She was not looking for money. She was looking for a name, a card, something that would tell her where to return it. What she found instead was enough cash to make her breath go shallow for just a second. She didn't count it, but she knew what $500 looked like in 20s, and this was more than that. There were 3 black credit cards, the kind with no numbers printed on the front, just a name embossed so faintly she had to tilt it toward the fluorescent light to read it. A gym membership card. A business card with nothing on it but a phone number in small gray type. And behind all of that, tucked into a slim vertical sleeve, a New York State driver's license. The face on it was severe and angular, the photograph taken with the kind of joyless efficiency that suggested the man had somewhere better to be. Dark eyes that looked like they'd already assessed the camera and found it lacking. A jaw built for disapproval. The name printed below the photograph was, Callum Vrent. Mara stared at it. She knew that name. Not the way you know a friend's name or a neighbor's name. The way you know a name that appears in headlines. In financial quarterlies. In the kind of business news her older brother forwarded to her with the subject line, "This is what serious money looks like." Callum Vrent was the founder and chairman of Vrent Capital Group, which owned, depending on which article you read, somewhere between 40 and 60 companies, a portfolio of commercial real estate that included a significant portion of Lower Manhattan, and a reputation for being the most private person in a city that made sport of knowing everything about everyone. The train reached her stop. Mara stood up, put the wallet carefully in the inner pocket of her coat, and got off. She spent the first 3 hours of her workday the same way she always did, answering emails for the small nonprofit arts organization where she worked as a program coordinator, updating a grant application spreadsheet, and eating half a granola bar she'd meant to finish on the train. But the wallet sat in her coat pocket all morning like a stone she couldn't stop feeling the weight of. During her lunch break she went outside, sat on a bench in the small concrete plaza across from her building, and took it out again. She thought about her options. She could turn it into an MTA lost and found, but she'd done that once before with a phone she'd found, and it had taken the owner 6 weeks and 2 visits to a transit office in Queens to get it back. She could call the number on the business card, which had no name attached and could belong to anyone. She could, theoretically, keep the cash and mail the cards back anonymously, which she entertained for exactly 4 seconds before her mother's voice rose in her chest like a tide. Or she could find another way. She Googled Callum Vrent. The results were immediate and extensive and mostly useless. There were photographs from charity galas where he appeared at the edge of the frame, slightly turned, as though he'd been caught rather than posed. There were financial news pieces with quotes attributed to his office rather than directly to him. There was a profile in a business magazine from 3 years ago that described him as, and this was the phrase the journalist had apparently decided was worth printing, aggressively non-public. His company's main office was listed 47 floors above 6th Avenue. There was a general contact email on the website. Mara wrote a short, careful email. She explained she had found a wallet on the C train that morning. She included the last 4 digits of the driver's license number so whoever read the email could verify without her having to give out personal information. She said she was happy to return it in person or arrange a drop-off, whichever was more convenient. She reread it twice, changed nothing, and hit send. She did not expect to hear back the same day. She heard back in 40 minutes. The reply came from an address she didn't recognize, a name that wasn't Callum Vrent, and it was 3 sentences long. It confirmed the wallet matched a description they had been looking for. It asked for her preferred time and location for the return. It was signed, Delia Marsh, Office of Callum Vrent. Mara looked at the email for a long moment. Then she typed back, tomorrow, 12:30, there's a coffee shop called Elm Settle on West 53rd. I'll have the wallet at the counter under my name. She didn't think anyone would actually send Callum Vrent himself. She assumed there would be an assistant, a driver, someone pleasant in a good coat who would thank her efficiently and leave. She was already planning what she'd order while she waited. She was wrong about almost everything. Elm Settle was the kind of coffee shop that had survived a decade of rising rents by being genuinely unremarkable. No exposed Edison bulbs, no reclaimed wood bar, no chalkboard wall covered in inspirational quotes written in someone's best handwriting. Just good coffee, tables that wobbled slightly on the uneven tile floor, and a counter staffed by a woman named Rosa who had worked there since the previous owner and had opinions about everything. Mara arrived at 12:20, ordered a flat white, and told Rosa she was expecting someone to pick up a wallet she'd left under her name. Rosa raised an eyebrow. Found wallet? Mara said yes. Rosa said she'd keep it under the counter. Then she looked at Mara the way she looked at everything, with a calm assessment that missed nothing. You look nervous. I'm not nervous, Mara said, and stirred her coffee. She had chosen a table near the window, not the one directly in the window, which felt too exposed, but the one just beside it, where she could see the door without appearing to watch it. She had changed her shoes that morning, which she was not going to examine too closely as a decision. She was wearing the gray coat she wore every day in November, and her hair was down, which was also something she was not going to examine. She was simply returning a wallet. This was a routine act of basic human decency. There was no reason for her pulse to be doing what it was currently doing. The door opened at 12:31. She knew it was him before she fully processed his face. There was something in the way the room shifted, not dramatically, not the way it happened in films, but the subtle, real way a space adjusts when someone walks into it who is used to rooms adjusting. He was taller than the photographs suggested. The photographs hadn't done much to capture the way he moved either, which was economical, deliberate, with no wasted motion. He wore a coat that was clearly expensive in the way that things are expensive when they're made well rather than made loudly, and he was alone. Mara had not accounted for him being alone. He scanned the room in a single pass and found her. She knew he'd found her because his direction changed by precisely enough degrees to confirm it. He crossed to the counter first, spoke briefly to Rosa, who glanced at Mara, then nodded and produced the wallet from under the counter. He held it for a moment, turned it over, and then looked at Mara again. Then he walked to her table. I'm told you're the one who found it, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Most of what she'd expected was apparently incorrect. I am, she said. I found it on the C train yesterday morning. Nobody seemed to have lost it, so I brought it home and looked for a way to contact you. He looked at her steadily. That look from the driver's license photograph, the one she'd assumed was the result of a bad camera moment, was apparently just his face. Not unkind, exactly. Precise. The look of a person who was used to gathering information quickly and didn't see the point in softening the process. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This surprised her enough that she said nothing for a moment, which was unusual, because Mara generally had something to say. Do you want to sit? She asked, after he'd already sat. Something moved briefly across his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it, like the shadow a smile would cast if it happened nearby. He said, it seemed wasteful to stand. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Everything in the wallet is there. I didn't count the cash, but I didn't touch it either, except to move the wallet from the train to my pocket and from my pocket to Rosa. He glanced toward the counter. You know her. I come here most days. She knows everyone. He looked at the wallet on the table between them, then back at her. Most people, he said, and his tone was not accusatory, simply factual, would have kept the cash. Most people, Mara said, didn't have my mother. He looked at her again. She had the distinct impression she was being added to some internal ledger she couldn't see. He said, "What does your mother have to do with it?" She raised her coffee cup. She drove 40 minutes once to return $2 in wrong change to a gas station. She said a person's character is just their habits under pressure. She said it so many times that it became one of those things you can't unhear. She paused. Also, I would have felt terrible. He was quiet for a moment. Rosa appeared with a second coffee that nobody had ordered and set it in front of him without comment before walking away. He looked at it, then at Mara. She does that, Mara said. She decides what you need. He picked up the cup. He seemed, for the first time since he'd entered the room, marginally less armored. Not open, not warm, not even particularly relaxed. But something in the angle of his shoulders had shifted in a way that suggested the fortress had noted her presence and not yet sounded an alarm. He said, "Callum Vrent." She said, "I know." He said, "You looked me up." She said, "You're not difficult to find. You're just difficult to know anything real about." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had texture. He looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup, and for the first time in the conversation she felt the full weight of his attention, which was, she would think later, a bit like standing in direct sunlight after a long winter. Uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. He said, "Mara Voss." She said, "You looked me up too." He said, "It's due diligence." She said, "On a person returning a lost wallet?" He said, "On a person who had access to a significant amount of my personal information and chose not to use it." She considered this. That's a very transactional way to describe human decency. He said nothing. But he didn't look away. And he finished the coffee Rosa had brought without any indication he intended to leave quickly. The lunch crowd moved around them. Rosa refilled Mara's cup without being asked. Outside the window, the November street carried its usual weight of people going places with great urgency and no particular joy. Mara said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "You're going to regardless." She smiled, which she hadn't planned on. "What were you doing on the C train?" For the first time, he looked something other than certain. Something brief and almost human moved through his expression before the architecture closed over it again. He said, "I ride it on Wednesdays." That's not an answer. He set down his cup. "No," he said. "It isn't." Then he stood, buttoned his coat, picked up the wallet, and looked at her one more time with that unreadable, considering expression. "Thank you, Mara Voss," he said. "For not being most people." He left. Rosa appeared at the table before the door had fully closed. She picked up the second cup, found a folded note tucked under the saucer, and handed it to Mara without a word. Mara unfolded it. A phone number. Nothing else. Below the number, in handwriting that was angular and controlled and somehow exactly what she'd expected, 2 words, "Due diligence." She did not call the number immediately. She told herself this was because she was busy, which was partially true. The grant application was due Friday, she had a site visit on Thursday at a community arts program in the Bronx, and the organization's annual donor report wasn't going to write itself. These were all real obligations and she attended to them genuinely and competently. But there were also 3 separate moments on Thursday evening, sitting on the edge of her bed in the blue lamp light with the folded note on the nightstand, when she picked up her phone and set it back down again. It wasn't that she was afraid. Mara Voss was 31 years old and had survived a landlord dispute that went to housing court, a breakup that resulted in her spontaneously adopting a large, anxious gray cat named Pebble, and 4 years of underfunded non-profit work, which was its own particular endurance sport. She wasn't afraid of a phone call. She was something more specific than afraid. She was aware, in a way she hadn't quite been before, that some thresholds, once crossed, changed the landscape on the other side. She called on Friday morning, at 7:45, before she could think too carefully about it. It rang twice. Then his voice. No greeting, just, "You waited 2 days." She said, "Good morning to you too." A pause. Then something that might have been amusement, though it was hard to tell, like reading weather through a frosted window. He said, "Good morning." She said, "I have a question." He said, "I assumed." She said, "What does due diligence mean, in this context? Because from where I'm standing it means either you looked up my address, my employer, and my general history because you were curious, or because you were being careful, and I want to know which one." The pause this time was longer. She heard something in the background, a window being opened, the distant sound of the city, the particular frequency of a high floor. He said, "Both." She said, "That's honest." He said, "I don't see the point of being otherwise." She thought about that. Then she said, "I'm going to a gallery opening tonight in Chelsea. It's a friend of mine, her first solo show. It starts at 7 and there's wine, which will be mediocre, but the work is very good. You don't have to come. But if you were going to do due diligence in person, that's where I'll be." The silence was the kind that made her want to fill it, which she resisted. He said, 57 West 22nd. She said, "You already know where it is." He said, "I own the building." She closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. She said, "Well. The wine is still mediocre." He said he'd be there at 7:15. He arrived at 7:12. Mara saw him the moment he walked in because the room did the same thing it had done in a coffee shop, that quiet recalibration, people registering a presence without quite knowing why. He was in different clothes, still the same fundamental aesthetic, muted and precise, but there was no coat now, just a dark jacket and the same economical self-possession. He found her across the room with the same single-pass scan she was beginning to recognize as his equivalent of a greeting. Her friend Danny, who was small and paint-stained even at her own opening and noticed everything, appeared at Mara's elbow and said, in a tone designed to carry only as far as Mara's ear, "Who is that?" Mara said, "It's complicated." Danny said, "He's looking at you the way people look at art they've decided to acquire." Mara said, "Please don't say that." Danny said, "I mean it as a compliment, he looks extremely serious about it." He reached her then and Danny melted away with the practiced invisibility of a person who understood she was in the middle of something. He stopped beside Mara and looked at the painting in front of her rather than at her, which she found, oddly, more comfortable than being looked at directly. The painting was large and abstract, all deep blues and fractured gold light, the kind of work that asked something of you before it gave anything back. She said, "What do you see?" He said, "Interrupted momentum. Something that was moving and then stopped, or was stopped." She looked at him sideways. He was still looking at the painting. She said, "Danny would love that." She said it's about her grandmother's letters, the ones that were never sent. He said, "The gold is the words." She said, "Yes." He looked at her then. She held it. He said, "You work for a non-profit." She said, "I do." He said, "You could make more elsewhere." She said, "I know. I'm not in it for the elsewhere." He considered this. He said, "What are you in it for?" She said, "I think access to art is a kind of oxygen. I think people who grow up without it are living at altitude and don't know why everything feels harder. I think my job is to lower the altitude a little." She paused. "You can tell me that's idealistic." He said, "I wasn't going to." She said, "Most people do." He said, I'm not most people either. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. She said, no. I'm beginning to think you're not. They spent 2 hours in that gallery. They moved through every piece. He asked questions that were not the questions most people asked, not what it meant, not what inspired it, but structural questions, compositional ones, questions about intention and constraint. When he didn't understand something he said so plainly, without apology, and when something struck him he was quiet in a way that meant it had reached somewhere real. At 9 o'clock Danny found them near the back wall and shook Callum's hand with both of hers and told him the painting he'd been standing in front of for 12 minutes was not for sale because she was keeping it, but that everything else was, and she'd already decided she liked him, which was her highest and rarest endorsement. He told her the interrupted momentum comment and she stared at him and said, "You can come back anytime." Outside on 22nd Street the November air had teeth. Mara wrapped her scarf and he stood on the sidewalk and did not hail a car immediately, which she noticed. She said, "You're not in a hurry." He said, "I'm frequently in a hurry. I'm choosing not to be." She said, "That's a very deliberate distinction." He said, "Most things worth doing require deliberate distinctions." She looked up at him on the sidewalk, the city noise around them, yellow cabs and a distant siren and music from somewhere she couldn't locate. She said, "Why do you ride the C train on Wednesdays?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My father took it every day for 30 years. He drove a delivery truck and then he took the C train home and then he made dinner because my mother worked evenings. He rode at the same car, same seat if he could get it, same time. He died 4 years ago. I ride it on Wednesdays." The city moved around them. She didn't say she was sorry, because he hadn't said it to receive condolence. She said, "The seat by the far door. Second car from the front." He looked at her. She said, "That's where I found the wallet." Something in his face changed so completely and so briefly that she almost missed it. The fortress did not fall, but something that had been braced against the world for a very long time leaned, just slightly, into a wind it had decided to let reach it. He said, "Yes. That's the one." She said, "I'm glad I found it, then." He said, "So am I." She didn't hear from him for 4 days. She was not counting. She was simply aware, in the ambient way you're aware of a sound that stopped, that the frequency had changed. She told herself this was fine. She had returned the wallet. They had been to a gallery. He was a man who owned 40 to 60 companies and a significant portion of Lower Manhattan, and she was a person who had once stress-eaten an entire sleeve of crackers during a budget meeting. These were not overlapping orbits. They had intersected briefly and unusually, and that was the kind of story she'd tell someday at a dinner party, the time she found a billionaire's wallet on the subway. Pebble, the anxious gray cat, had no opinion on this narrative because Pebble was asleep across Mara's laptop on Tuesday evening when the text came through. It was not from a number she had saved. She had deliberately not saved the number from the note, which was another thing she was not examining. The message said, "There's a talk on Thursday evening. An architect named Ferris Olo. I think you'd find him interesting. I'm going. If you want to come." Mara read it twice. Then she looked at Pebble, who had opened one eye. She said, "That's possibly the least romantic invitation I've ever received." Pebble closed the eye. She typed back, "What time?" He replied, 7. "I'll send the address." She replied, "You probably own the building." He replied, "I don't. It's a public library." She smiled at her phone in the dark of her apartment. She typed, "I'll be there." Ferris Olo was a 67-year-old architect from Lagos who had spent 4 decades building public spaces in cities that had been told they couldn't afford to think about beauty. He spoke for 90 minutes with the quiet authority of a person who had learned everything the hard way and decided the hard way was worth it. He talked about the politics of public space, about who gets to feel that a city belongs to them, about a library he built in a neighborhood where the previous building had been a detention center, and how he designed it so that every room had light, because he believed in the politics of light. Mara was so absorbed in the talk that she forgot for stretches that she was sitting beside someone. Then Callum would shift or lean slightly forward at something Olo said, and she'd remember. He did not look at her during the talk the way some people look sideways at the people they've brought, checking to see if they're impressed, soliciting a reaction. He simply listened, and occasionally his hand moved as though he were writing something, and she realized eventually that he was pressing his thumb against his palm in small movements, taking invisible notes. Afterward, in the library's main hall, Olo was surrounded immediately. Callum said, "Do you want to meet him?" She said, "Do you know him?" He said, "His practice built one of the first community centers I funded. Before I had the sense to keep my name off things." She looked at him. He said it so plainly, no performance in it, the way people talk about things that aren't secrets but aren't announcements either. She said, "You fund community centers." He said, "Among other things." She said, "That's not in any of the articles." He said, "I'm aware." He introduced her to Ferris Olo, who took both her hands and asked her what she did, and when she explained the arts access work, he said, "That's the work. Everything else is commentary," and he said it with the conviction of a man who'd been saying it since before she was born and hadn't run out of belief in it yet. On the sidewalk outside the library, it was colder now, a real December cold that had arrived without announcement. She turned up her collar. He said, "Did you eat?" She said, "I had crackers at my desk at 5. He said, "That's not eating." She said, "I was in a meeting." He said, "There's a place 2 blocks from here. It's not a restaurant anyone would take you to impress you. It's a place that makes one thing very well." She said, "What thing?" He said, "Roast chicken." She said, "That's a very specific pitch." He said, "I'm not interested in being vague." The place was exactly what he described. 8 tables. No menu on the wall, just a chalkboard that said what it was and the price, and that was the whole conversation. The chicken was extraordinary. They ate mostly in silence in the beginning, the good kind of silence, the kind that 2 people arrive at when neither of them feels the need to fill space with noise. She asked him about the community centers and he talked about them with a directness she was finding was simply his register, no hedging, no self-congratulation, just the thing and why it mattered. 3 centers in the Bronx, 1 in East New York, a partnership with a school in the Rockaways that had taken 2 years to structure correctly and was finally, as of this spring, operating at full capacity. She said, "Why not put your name on it?" He said, "Because then it becomes about me and it isn't about me. It's about a 14-year-old kid who needs somewhere to be after school that isn't a street corner. My name on the door doesn't help the kid. My name on the door helps my reputation." She said, "Most people at your level want the reputation." He said, "Most people at my level got there by accumulating what other people want. I got there by being indifferent to most of it." She said, "And yet." He said, "And yet." She looked at him across the small table. She said, "You're not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I'm not sure. Someone colder. Someone who measures everything by what it returns." He said, "I do measure everything by what it returns. I've just expanded the definition of return." She thought about that. She said, "Your father." He said, "Yes." She said, "He didn't ride the C train to return something, did he? He rode it because it was his way of being in the city the same way everyone else was in it." Callum was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant was small and warm and the owner was moving between tables without hurry. He said, "He used to say, I could take a car. But then I'd just be moving through the city. On the train I'm in it." He said, he could afford a car by the end. He still took the train. She said, "So do you." He said, "So do I." She said, "That's not the habit of someone cold." He looked at her across the table. Something in his face had loosened further than she'd seen it, not open, not unguarded, but less defended. He said, "You're perceptive." She said, "I pay attention to people. It's most of the job." He said, "Most of mine too. Different scale, same instinct." They stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty. He walked her to the subway, which she told him was unnecessary, and he said he wasn't doing it out of necessity. At the top of the stairs she stopped and he stopped with her. The cold wind came up from the tunnel in a gust. She said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly even if it's a strange answer." He said, "All right." She said, "What is this?" He didn't deflect or perform confusion. He looked at her steadily and said, "I think it's the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a long time. And I'm trying to understand it without ruining it. Which is new for me." She said, "What do you usually do?" He said, "Decide efficiently and move." She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I'm standing at the top of a subway entrance in December being deliberately inefficient." She smiled. He did too, the real one this time, not the shadow of one, and it changed the entire architecture of his face. She said, "I'll call you." He said, "Good." She went down the stairs. At the bottom she looked back up and he was still there, hands in his pockets, watching her go. Not urgently. Just watching, the way you watch something you intend to understand more completely. She called him the next morning. Not because she'd planned to, not because she'd manufactured a reason, but because she woke up at 6:15 with a thought about something Ferris Olo had said the night before, about the politics of light, and the thought connected immediately and involuntarily to Callum, and she was already halfway through typing a message before she realized she'd decided to call instead. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "The library Olo built over the detention center. Did you know about it before last night?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you say so during the talk?" He said, "It wasn't the time for me to talk." She said, "Does it bother you that he doesn't know who funded it?" He said, "No. He knows the foundation. He doesn't need to know I'm the foundation." She said, "That's a very particular kind of anonymity." He said, "I've spent a long time building a particular kind of privacy. Parts of it serve me and parts of it I do out of habit. I'm not always sure which is which anymore." She thought about that. She said, "The articles say you haven't been photographed at a social event in 2 years." He said, "The gallery was a social event." She said, "I noticed that." He said, "I'm aware that you noticed. You notice most things." She pulled her knees up on the couch and Pebble relocated to her lap with the burdened expression of someone who has been inconvenienced but accepts their fate. She said, "Can I ask you something about the wallet?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Was it an accident? Losing it?" The pause was just long enough. He said, "What makes you ask that?" She said, "Because you ride the same car on the same day every week in memory of your father. And you're a person who controls a great deal. I'm curious how a wallet ends up under an umbrella on the floor of the second car from the front of the C train." He said, "That's very specific detective work." She said, "It's attention. Which you told me is most of your job too." He was quiet. Then he said, "I was thinking about something. I set the wallet down on the seat beside me and I forgot it." That's the truthful answer. She said, "What were you thinking about?" He said, "Something I needed to decide. Something I'd been deferring." She said, "Did you decide it?" He said, "The wallet led somewhere unexpected. I deferred a little longer." She said, "Are you going to tell me what it was?" He said, "Not yet." She accepted this. She said, "All right." She said, "I'm making coffee, do you want me to bring you some later?" A pause that surprised her. He said, "That's a very ordinary thing to offer." She said, "I do ordinary things. I'm an ordinary person." He said, "You are not ordinary. She said, I work at a non-profit in Midtown, I have an anxious cat, and I found your wallet on the subway. I'm pretty ordinary. He said, the woman who found the wallet could have kept everything in it and nobody would have known. She chose not to, and then she found a way to return it that protected my information rather than exploiting it. Then she emailed with specificity and care and met me in a coffee shop she trusted because it was staffed by a woman she knew. Then she asked direct questions without apology. Then she took me to a gallery where she knew every piece and had considered every one. Then she told me what she believed about her work in a sentence and a half that contained more clarity than most mission statements I've read. He paused. Ordinary is a word you use to make yourself smaller. You should stop. Mara sat very still in her apartment in the morning light with Pebble on her lap and her coffee going cold on the table. She said, that might be the most you've said at once. He said, I've been thinking it for a while. She said, I'm coming over with coffee. He said, I thought you'd ask for my address. She said, you own a building on West 53rd and you have a main office on 6th Avenue. I'm guessing you live somewhere between them. Am I wrong? He said, 18 West 48th, 16th floor. I'll tell the front desk. She said, I'm not scared of front desks. He said, I know. That's one of the things. She arrived at 8:40 with 2 coffees from a place she liked on 47th Street, not Elm Settle, because that felt like returning to something when she was still moving forward, and a paper bag with 2 pastries she'd bought because the woman at the counter had said they were good and Mara believed people who worked in bakeries about what was worth eating. The building lobby was pale marble and very quiet, and a man at the desk nodded when she gave her name as though she were expected, which she was. The elevator opened into a small private vestibule. Callum opened the door before she knocked. She looked at him. He looked different without a coat on, less armored, which made sense. He was in a gray sweater and his jaw was unshaved, and he looked, for the first time, simply human rather than composed. She said, you look less like a business magazine. He said, good morning. She said, here. She gave him a coffee. He took it and held the door. She walked in. The apartment was not what she'd imagined, though she tried not to imagine it. It was large but not cavernous, with high ceilings and a wall of windows that showed a rooftop landscape, water towers and slate-gray sky and the particular compressed geometry of Midtown from above. The furniture was spare but not cold. There were books everywhere, stacked on shelves, on the floor beside a reading chair, on the kitchen island as though he'd been interrupted mid-page in 6 places simultaneously. There was a chessboard on a low table near the window, game in progress. One long framed photograph on the main wall, black and white, a street she didn't recognize, busy with people and motion. She walked toward it. He said, it's a street in Lagos. She said, Olo. He said, he took it. It was the street where he grew up. He gave me a print when we finished the first building. She looked at it for a long time. The photograph was crowded and alive, and there was something in the motion of it that felt like Olo's talk, like a person who believed cities were made of people and not the other way around. She said, you have good things on your walls. He said, I have one thing on my walls. She turned. He was watching her move through the room with that careful, considered attention, the same way he'd looked at Danny's paintings, the same way he looked at the city from the rooftop level of his own window. She understood then, in a way she hadn't quite before, that Callum Vrent collected things that told him something true. Not expensive things, not impressive things, things that were real. She held up the paper bag. She said, I got pastries from a woman who told me they were good. He said, do you always take bakery recommendations that seriously? She said, I take seriously anyone who's made something and knows it. He said, that's how I started. He said it simply. Knowing what I'd made and what it was worth. She set the bag on the kitchen island beside a book he'd left open face down. She looked at the title. He said, don't judge me by what I leave open. She said, would never. But she looked at it. It was a collection of essays on urban planning, and the page he'd stopped on was marked with a handwritten note on a yellow slip of paper. She couldn't read the note from where she was standing. He didn't offer her a closer look. She didn't ask. Some things earned their way. December moved the way December always does in New York, too fast and too cold, and with the particular insistence of a city that treats even its most contemplative season as a logistical event. Mara's grant report was submitted. The site visit went well. Danny sold 6 pieces from the show, including the interrupted momentum painting to a buyer she described as someone who looked like they needed it, which Mara suspected was Callum, though she didn't ask and he didn't tell her, which she decided was its own kind of answer. They found a rhythm. It didn't announce itself as a rhythm. It arrived the way most real things arrive, not in a gesture or a declaration but in accumulation. A text on a Tuesday about something one of them had read. Dinner at places nobody would have taken anyone to impress them. A walk across the park on a Saturday that had no destination and didn't need one. He came to her office holiday party, which she mentioned only in passing, and he showed up anyway, and he stood with her colleagues for 40 minutes and asked them specific questions about their work, and her coworker Priya found Mara in the kitchen afterward and whispered, "He's not what I thought," and Mara said, "No. He never is." She met his world in stages, which was how he offered it, not all at once, but in careful increments that felt like trust being extended rather than performed. He took her to a quarterly meeting of the foundation board, not as a guest but as someone he wanted to hear a conversation, and she sat beside him and listened, and afterward he asked her what she thought and listened to everything she said without interruption. She told him the grant structure for the arts education program felt diffuse, and he said, "Explain what you mean," and she did, and he said, "That's the problem we've had for 3 years and nobody said it that plainly." He fixed it in the next cycle. She did not know what they were. She did not ask. She was 31 and had learned to be patient with things that were becoming themselves. He was 44 and had learned, or was learning, to be patient with things he couldn't control by deciding them. They moved around each other with the careful attention of 2 people who understood that what they were building was fragile in the way that real things are fragile, not weak, just requiring of care. His assistant Delia, who was brisk and efficient and, Mara discovered, had worked for him for 11 years, told Mara in the lobby one morning when they passed each other, "You're the first person he's brought to a board meeting in 6 years." Mara said, "Is that significant?" Delia said, "He didn't bring anyone to his brother's wedding," and let himself out the front door before Mara could ask a follow-up question. His brother was named Theo, and Mara met him on a Thursday in mid-December when Callum had mentioned they were having dinner, and then said, with the same directness he brought to everything, "It'll be the 2 of us and Theo. I'd like you to come." She said, "Is this an introduction?" He said, "It's dinner." She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes. It's an introduction." Theo Vrent was 3 years younger than Callum and appeared, at first glance, to be his complete opposite. Where Callum moved with compression and economy, Theo moved loosely, with the easy friendliness of someone who had never stopped being comfortable at parties. He was already at the table when they arrived, and he stood up immediately and shook Mara's hand and said, "He told me you found his wallet on the C train, and I have to tell you that's the most romantic origin story I've ever heard." Callum said, "We're not doing that." Theo said, "I'm doing it." He looked at Mara. "Was there a lot of cash in it?" Mara said, "Enough that I looked around twice." Theo said, "And you gave it all back?" Mara said, "Every last dollar." Theo looked at his brother. He said, "I like her." He said it to Callum directly, without the performance of a compliment meant to be overheard, just a flat, genuine statement. Callum looked at his brother for a moment in a way that Mara recognized by now as his version of warmth, a sustained attention that didn't reach his expression but was everywhere in his stillness. He said, "I know." Theo talked through dinner the way some people talk, with enthusiasm and without self-editing, about his wife Jenna, who was at home with their 2-year-old daughter who had recently entered what Theo described as her feral phase, and about the architectural firm where he worked, and about a building he'd just been assigned that was giving him trouble. Callum listened and offered specific observations at specific moments and at one point said something about the structural problem that made Theo put down his fork and say, "How do you know that?" And Callum said, "I read the code when you were in grad school because you asked me to and I read everything completely." Theo stared at him. He said, "That was 15 years ago." Callum said, "Yes." Theo looked at Mara and said, "This is what he's like." She said, "I'm starting to understand." At the end of dinner, when Callum went to settle the check, Theo leaned across the table and said, "He's been better since October. Less like a building and more like a person." Mara said, "October was when I found the wallet." Theo said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." She thought about that on the cab ride home. Callum sat beside her and looked out the window at the city passing, and she looked at his profile in the amber light, the set of his jaw, the slight tension that never fully left the space between his eyes, and she thought about what it cost a person to build walls that solid and what it would mean to let them be something other than walls. She said, "Theo thinks you've been different." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you?" He turned from the window and looked at her. In the back of the cab with the city light crossing his face, he looked less like a fortress and more like a person who was standing in a doorway he'd thought was permanently sealed, surprised to find it could move. He said, "I think I stopped deferring." She said, "The thing you were deciding on the train." He said, "Yes." She said, "What was it?" He said, "Whether I wanted to keep living the way I was. Or whether I wanted to change something." He said it simply. Not dramatically. The way you say a thing that's been true for a long time and you've only just found the language for it. He said, "I hadn't found a reason. And then a reason found me on the floor of the second car." The cab stopped at her building. She didn't move immediately. She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "You could come up." He looked at her. She held it. He said, "I should tell you something first." She said, "Okay." He said, "I'm not good at this. I'm not warm by instinct, I'm warm by decision, and sometimes I make the decision too late or not at all. I work too much and I think in structures, and I've ended things before they started because it was easier than being uncertain." He said, "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're working with." She said, "I work with underfunded arts organizations and anxious cats and grant applications that are due on Fridays. I'm not afraid of difficult material." He said, "That's either very brave or very naive." She said, "It's neither. It's just that I pay attention. And I've been paying attention to you for 6 weeks and I think the material is worth the work." He said nothing for a moment. Then he paid the driver and got out. She made tea because it was late and she'd had enough coffee, and he stood in her kitchen while the kettle boiled and looked at her apartment the way she'd looked at his, with that gathering, cataloging attention. It was smaller than his, dramatically so, one bedroom with a living room that doubled as an office and a kitchen that required 2 people to stand at an angle. The walls were the opposite of spare, covered in things she'd collected, a poster from Danny's first group show 3 years ago, a small framed pencil drawing of Pebble from when she'd gone through a brief phase of life drawing classes, a postcard she'd bought at a museum in her college years and never taken down, a cork board with receipts and business cards, and a photo of her mother and her at someone's wedding, her mother laughing with her whole body the way she always did. Callum stood in front of the cork board for a long time. He said, "Is that your mother?" She said, "Yes. At my cousin's wedding in 2021. She laughed like that at everything." He said, "Does she still?" She said, "She does. She lives in Albany now. She calls me every Sunday and tells me what she's noticed during the week. Small things. A cardinal in the yard. Someone who let her go first in line at the post office. She collects small good things and she delivers them to me on Sundays." He looked at the photograph a moment longer. He said, "My father did something similar. He kept a list in his wallet," she said, and Callum turned from the board and looked at her, his wallet, in a small folded paper he replaced every year. A list of things he was glad existed. She felt the weight of that sentence settle in the room. She said, "Was it in the wallet I found?" He said, "Yes. It's still in there." A piece of folded notebook paper in the bills section, behind the cash. He said, "It's the thing I would have replaced everything else for." She said, "I found the wallet on the seat where he used to sit." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you lost it that particular day because you were thinking about whether to change how you were living." He said, "Yes." She said, "I don't believe in fate. But I believe in the meaning we make of the things that happen." He said, "What meaning do you make of it?" She set 2 cups on the counter and poured. She said, "I make of it that sometimes you need to lose something to find out what it is. And sometimes what it leads you to is the thing you were ready for and didn't know." He took his cup. He said, "That's not a small thing to believe." She said, "My mother raised me to collect the small good things. I think this is one." He was close enough that she could see the exact moment the last of the held distance became a choice he let go of. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. He simply set his cup down and reached across the short space between them and put his hand against her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, that precise economy of motion, and looked at her with an expression she had no name for yet but which she was certain she would be learning the name of for a long time. He said, "Mara." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to stop being inefficient now." He kissed her in the small kitchen with the kettle cooling on the counter and Pebble watching from the doorway with the burdened expression of a creature who had known this was coming and resented the timing. She kissed him back with both hands in the fabric of his sweater and felt the fortress exhale. Not fall. Not disappear. Simply breathe. They stayed up until 2 in the morning talking. Not about anything constructed. About his father's list, which she asked him about and he described from memory, specific birds he'd liked watching, the name of the street where he'd grown up in Queens, the sound the subway makes when it enters a station, coffee with too much sugar, his son's voices on the phone, the smell of a bakery. Callum said it quietly and without sentimentality, and she sat beside him on her second-hand couch with Pebble between them and listened to every word. She told him about her mother driving 40 minutes for $2 and he said, "Tell me the whole story." So she did. The gas station attendant had been a young man who'd seemed exhausted and her mother had said, "That's money he miscounted out of his own drawer, he'll go home thinking he made an error," and they'd driven 40 minutes in a light rain and the young man's face when her mother gave him the $2 and said, without ceremony, "You gave me too much change," had been the kind of face you don't forget. Mara said, she didn't make a production of it. She just said that someone's $2 and they needed it back. He said, "Your wallet didn't land on that floor by accident, in that sense." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean the person who found it was shaped by a woman who drives 40 minutes for $2. Someone else with a different upbringing finds the same wallet and makes a different choice." She said, "You're saying I was prepared for it." He said, "I'm saying character is what happens before the decision, and yours happened a long time ago." She looked at him. She said, "You said that like my mother." He said, "I think your mother is very wise." She said, "She's going to want to meet you." He said, "I'm aware that's significant." She said, "Is that okay?" He said, "I'd like to meet the woman who raised someone who returns wallets at no cost to herself and talks to bakery workers about what's worth eating." She smiled at him in the low light of her small apartment. He was still somewhat formal in his syntax, still precise, still more buttoned than unbuttoned, but underneath all of it was something warm and real and unhurried that had been there from the beginning and was simply emerging at its own rate, the way things that have been held in do when they finally find somewhere safe to be. He left at 2:15. At the door he paused and looked at her in the hallway light and said, "Your mother's right." She said, "About what specifically?" "She has a lot of positions." He said, "Character is what you do under pressure." He paused. "Thank you for being who you are when you found the wallet." She said, "Thank you for losing it on your father's seat." He said nothing. He just looked at her with that expression she was learning the shape of, and then he left, and she stood in the doorway a moment and listened to the elevator and then closed the door and went back to Pebble and sat on the couch and let the whole evening move through her, slowly and completely, the way you let something good be real. January arrived with its flat light and its particular cruelty and its annual gift of making everyone in New York take stock of what they were doing and why. Mara took stock from the window of a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, her coat still on, her hands wrapped around a cup that was too hot to drink, watching the street. She was not unhappy. She was simply awake to the size of things. She and Callum had slipped into each other's lives with a speed that surprised her when she thought about it directly. It had not felt fast in the living of it, because each step had felt considered, earned, the natural consequence of the one before it. But looking at the sum, she could see it was fast, and she could see, sitting in the coffee shop with her too hot coffee, that there were parts of his world she hadn't touched yet, and parts of her own she hadn't offered. He had met Danny, briefly, and Priya at the holiday party. He had not met her mother, though the call was scheduled for the coming weekend, and her mother had texted her 3 times since the meeting was planned, not asking questions, just sending small observations, a story about a neighbor's dog, a photo of the first snowfall in Albany, once simply the word good, which Mara understood as shorthand for something much longer. He called her that Tuesday at 11:15, which was not unusual, and said, "Do you have time this afternoon?" She said, "I have a call at 2. Otherwise yes." He said, "There's something I'd like to show you." She said, "You own it?" He said, "In a way." She arrived at an address in the South Bronx at 3:30. The building was not large. It had a new facade of pale brick and glass that sat beside its older neighbors with quiet confidence. Above the entrance, in simple serif letters, the Ward Center. She did not know that name. She went inside. The lobby was warm and smelled of paint and woodworking and something sweet from a kitchen she could hear but not see. Children's voices came from down the hall. A teenager was sitting on a bench with a sketchbook, drawing with a focused intensity she recognized from watching Danny work. A woman at the desk looked up and said, "You must be Mara. He said you'd be coming. Go on through." He was in the main hall, talking to a man she didn't know, a tall man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the easy authority of someone who had built something with his hands and his years. When he saw her come in he said something to the man, who nodded, and then he crossed the room to her. She looked around. The hall had high windows and wooden floors and along one wall a gallery of student work, drawings and photographs and collages arranged with care. At the far end, an open double door led into what looked like a recording studio. To the left, a room full of musical instruments, an actual room, guitars on stands and keyboards and a drum kit and a small stage. She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "What is this?" He said, "It's a community arts center." She said, "You built it." He said, "The foundation built it. 4 years ago." She paused. "After you lost your own father?" He said, "About 6 months after." She turned and looked at the wall of student work. A photograph of a street at dusk, shot from below, light on the top of a building. A charcoal drawing of hands. A collage of magazine text that read in pieces, "I was here, I made this, I matter." She said, "You built it because of your father's list." He came to stand beside her. He said, "He had a line on the list I didn't understand until he was gone. It said, the places where people feel they exist." He said it quietly. I didn't know what that meant until I was cleaning out his apartment and I found the list and read it again. And then I understood. He meant the places that tell you that you're real and your story is worth telling. She said, "The politics of light." He said, "Yes." She stood in the hall of the Ward Center and looked at student work on walls lit by windows that someone had put in the right place, and felt the way you feel when two things you already believe turn out to be connected at the root. She said, "This is what the wallet note meant." He looked at her. She said, "Due diligence. You weren't just investigating me, You were checking whether I understood this. Whether what I said about my work was what I meant. He said, I was checking whether you were real. She said, was I? He said, you're standing here. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that had no defense in it at all, which was, she was learning, rarer and more significant than anything he said. She said, the thing you were deferring on the train. He said, letting someone in. She said, and you decided. He said, I lost the wallet and you returned it and then you went to Elm Settle and you told Rosa and you sat at the table nearest the window instead of in it and you ordered a flat white and you waited. He said, that was enough to decide. She said, that's a lot to read into a coffee order. He said, it wasn't the coffee. It was that you didn't put yourself in the window. She looked at him. He said, people who want to be seen put themselves in the window. You chose to be where you could watch the door without being the spectacle. You were careful with yourself. He paused. I respect careful people. She said, you are the most specific person I've ever met. He said, I'm aware. She said, I mean that as a compliment. He said, I know. She looked back at the wall of student work. The photograph of the lit building at dusk. She said, can I bring Danny here? He said, I was going to suggest it. She said, she'd do a residency in a heartbeat. He said, I thought as much. There's a budget for it. She said, you were planning this before today. He said, I was planning it before the gallery. She turned and stared at him. He looked back without apology. She said, you are impossible. He said, that's been said. She said, I mean it as a different kind of compliment. He said, I'm aware of the distinction. The teenager with the sketchbook walked through the hall and glanced at them as he passed and then kept going, the total indifference of a person absorbed in their own work. The woman from the desk appeared with 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set them on a bench and walked away. Mara looked at the cups and then at Callum. She said, does everyone do that? He said, bring me coffee unexpectedly. She said, yes. He said, only the people who are paying attention. She picked up a cup. She said, to Rosa. He picked up the other. He said, to Rosa. They drank the coffee in the main hall of the ward center while somewhere down the corridor a kid who was feeling very real played 3 chords on a guitar, imperfect and earnest and insisting on being heard. Her mother called on Sunday at 10. Mara had her coffee ready. She sat at the kitchen table with Pebble on the chair across from her and the phone on speaker, which was how these calls always happened, her mother's voice filling the room the way her mother had always filled rooms, with warmth and no performance and a complete inability to pretend anything was other than what it was. Her mother's name was Carol, and she taught high school English in Albany, and she had raised Mara alone from the time Mara was 9 with the consistent energy of a woman who had decided that limitation was a direction, not a destination. She said, tell me about him. Mara said, I have been. Carol said, tell me more. Tell me a different part. Mara thought about it. She said, he's specific. About everything. He asks questions that are actually the right questions, not the ones people ask to seem interested, the real ones underneath those. He built a community arts center in the Bronx after his father died because his father had a list in his wallet of things he was glad existed, and one of the things on the list was places where people feel they exist, and he built a place like that. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he kept his father's list. Mara said, in the same wallet. Carol said, the one you found. Mara said, yes. Carol said, Mara. There was something in the way she said the name, the particular tone she used when she was about to say the thing underneath all the other things. She said, I need you to know that I'm not going to make a big thing of this. But I also need you to know that what you're describing is someone who builds things for the right reasons and carries his father's words in his pocket and found you by losing something. She paused. That's not small. Mara said, I know. Carol said, are you being careful? Mara said, I'm trying. Carol said, don't try too hard. She said, sometimes careful becomes a way of staying outside the thing. Mara said, that sounds like something he would say about me. Carol said, then he's been paying attention. Good. They talked for 40 more minutes about other things, the cardinal in the yard, a student who'd written a remarkable essay about his grandmother, the post office line. At the end Carol said, I'd like to meet him. Whenever that is. Whenever you're ready. No pressure. Mara said, he wants to meet you too. He said he wants to meet the woman who raised someone who returns wallets. Carol was quiet for a beat. Then she said, he said that? Mara said, more or less verbatim. Carol said, all right. He can come to Albany. Mara said, he'll probably offer to send a car. Carol said, he can send a car to pick himself up from the train station. He'll be taking the train. Mara laughed. She said, I'll tell him. Carol said, good. He came to Albany in February on a Saturday morning. He took the train, which Mara had told him her mother had specified, and Carol had made a pot of chicken soup because it was cold and because she cooked when she was thinking, and the kitchen smelled of it when Mara and Callum arrived. Carol opened the door and looked at Callum with the frank, open assessment of a woman who taught 17-year-olds and had no mechanism for pretense, and Callum looked back at her with the focused attention he brought to everything he found worth understanding, and they stood in the doorway in the February cold for about 3 seconds before Carol said, come in, it's freezing. I made soup, and she turned and led the way into the kitchen as though the assessment were complete. Callum looked at Mara. She shrugged. She said, she decided in the doorway. He said, your mother is efficient. She said, don't let her hear you say that, she'll like you even more. The soup was good and the table was small, and Carol talked the way Carol always talked, with the full presence of someone who believed that the people you were with were worth being with, and she asked Callum questions that were not gentle or managing, real questions, about his father and about the ward center and about what he thought the city was failing to do for the people who lived in it. He answered all of them without deflection, and at one point said something that made Carol set her spoon down and say, I've been trying to explain that to my department for 3 years, and that's exactly right, which was Carol's version of a standing ovation. After lunch they walked in the cold, the 3 of them, and then Carol found an errand she suddenly needed to run, which Mara recognized as the thing her mother did when she wanted to give people time, and Mara and Callum walked back alone through the quiet Saturday streets of Albany with their hands in their pockets, their breath visible, the sky the particular low white of a February afternoon. He said, she's remarkable. Mara said, I know. He said, she looked at me in the doorway the way my father looked at things he was deciding about. She said, what did he decide? He said, he usually liked what he looked at. He had generous eyes. She said, so does she. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to tell you something. She said, okay. He said, I called the foundation this week and restructured the arts education grant. He said, I used the framework you described. The one about diffuse structure. She said, you didn't tell me. He said, I'm telling you now. She said, that's not how collaboration usually works. He said, I know. I should have asked. He said it directly, no hedge in it. Not an apology performed for effect, but an acknowledgement made because it was accurate. He said, I'm not practiced at consulting someone. I make decisions in a direction. I'm trying to change the direction of that. She said, by telling me after. He said, by telling you. Which is further than before. She looked at him sideways. She said, that's fair. He said, I would like, in the future, to tell you before. She said, I would like that too. He said, then that's what we'll do. She said, you make decisions very quickly. He said, I've been deciding this one since October. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. The street was empty and cold, and somewhere a dog was barking at something it had decided was dangerous. She said, Callum. He said, yes. She said, "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He said, "I'm saying I've been moving toward you since a Wednesday morning on the C train, and I'd like to stop moving toward and simply be here." She looked at him in the pale February light. He was not soft. He was not easy. He was specific and precise and armored in ways that would require patience she was not always sure she had, and he was standing in the cold on a street in Albany telling her he wanted to stop moving toward and simply be here, which was, she thought, the most exact and accurate thing anyone had ever said to her about the shape of wanting someone. She said, "That's the most you've committed to a sentence since the gallery." He said, "I've been composing it." She said, "How long?" He said, "Since the coffee shop. I've been editing it down." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Then I'll say yes to the sentence you edited it to." He stepped forward and kissed her in the cold, his hands on her face, the city sounds of Albany around them, the dog barking, a car passing, a window somewhere with music. When he pulled back, his thumbs were against her cheekbones and his eyes were open, and she was looking at a person who had been armored for a very long time and had decided, at great deliberate cost, to be something else. She said, "Your father would have liked this." He said, "I think so too." She said, "The soup was good." He said, "Yes." She said, "My mother's going to text me in about 12 minutes asking how it went." He said, "Tell her good." She said, "She'll want more than that." He said, "Tell her the soup worked." She said, "She'll understand that." He said, "I thought she would." Spring came the way it always does in New York, not gradually but suddenly. One morning the air changed and the trees that had looked dead for months remembered what they were for and began the whole audacious project again. Mara noticed it on the way to work, that specific quality of March light that is different from February light, the way a decision is different from consideration. She texted Callum, "The city changed today." He replied within a minute, "I know. I noticed on the train." She smiled at her phone on the corner of 47th and 6th and then crossed the street without looking up, which was inadvisable and which she did anyway. The months between February and spring had been, in the language Mara would use later when she tried to explain them to Danny over wine at Danny's kitchen table, the months where it became real. Not the becoming real of a romance, she'd say, but the becoming real of a life, which was different, which was harder and more interesting and considerably less photogenic. They had disagreed, 3 times, in ways that mattered. Once about the grant restructure, which they'd finally talked through completely and which resulted in a framework they'd both contributed to, which she thought was better than either version alone. Once about something smaller and more personal, about what it meant when one of them cancelled plans, which had touched something old in both of them and required a longer conversation than either of them had expected. Once about the Ward Center's next phase of expansion, where she'd pushed back on his instinct to scale quickly and he'd pushed back on her instinct to protect what already worked, and they'd sat with the disagreement long enough for it to produce something better than either position. He was not easy. She hadn't needed him to be. He was worth it, which was different. Danny had been to the Ward Center by the end of February and by the beginning of March had proposed a residency idea that made the center's director say, "We've been waiting for something like this," and Callum had signed the agreement with the same efficiency he applied to everything, and Danny had texted Mara, "I don't know what he is but please keep him." Mara replied, "I'm working on it." Danny replied, "Work faster." Priya, at the office, had noticed a change in Mara that she described as, "You seem like you're getting enough sleep for the first time since I've known you." Mara said, "I'm sleeping the same amount." Priya said, "Then you seem like you've stopped doing that thing where you're here but also somewhere else at the same time." Mara said, "Oh." Priya said, "Yeah. It's good. You're all here now." She was all here. She understood what Priya meant. There was a quality of presence she'd arrived at that felt less like something acquired and more like something returned to. She'd been a diffuse person, spreading herself thin across too many obligations and too few real ones, and without entirely planning to she had been collected by a season of specificity, by a person who brought his full attention to everything and expected the same in return. She brought him, one afternoon in early spring, to her mother's classroom. Not in a planned way. Carol had mentioned she was doing a unit on contemporary writing and Mara mentioned that and Callum said, "I'd like to hear it," and they'd taken the train to Albany on a Thursday without ceremony and he'd sat in the back of Carol's classroom for 90 minutes while she taught a group of 17-year-olds how to read for the thing underneath the words. He'd been completely still the whole time, which was how she knew he was fully absorbed. Afterward in the hallway a student had stopped and said to Callum, "Are you the person who built the Ward Center?" And Callum had looked at the student and said, "The foundation did," and the student had said, "My cousin goes there, she learned to record music there, she's going to study audio engineering," and Callum had looked at the student with full attention and said, "What's her name?" and the student had said the name and Callum had said, "I'll make sure she knows about the scholarship program," and the student had walked away and Mara had looked at him and said, "You knew her cousin's name?" He said, "We have 140 students." He said, "I read the files." She said, "All of them." He said, "That's my job." She thought about that on the train back to the city. The files. 140 names and stories, every one of them real to him, every one of them a person who needed the place where they felt they existed. His father's list. His father's words in his pocket. The seat on the C train where he left a wallet on the worst distracted day and a woman raised by someone who drove 40 minutes for $2 picked it up and made a different choice. She was looking out the train window at the landscape passing, the brown fields and the scattered trees and the water towers, when she felt his hand turn over on the seat between them, palm up, an open question. She put her hand in it. He closed his fingers around hers and went back to looking out his own window and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was comfortable in the way that only happens when two people have stopped performing the relationship and started living it. At Penn Station he said, "Your mother told me something in the hallway before we left." She said, "I saw you talking." He said, "She said, be patient with her, she's careful because she was taught to be, but underneath careful is brave." She said, "She just needs to know the floor holds." Mara looked at him. He said, "I told her I'd been testing the floor." She said, "That sounds ominous." He said, "I meant that I've been moving carefully because I wanted you to know it held." She said, "Callum." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know the floor holds." He looked at her. She said, "I've known for a while. I was just being deliberate about it." He said, "So was I." She said, "So we were both being so careful that we were careful at each other." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's very us." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm done being careful." He said, "Good." He squeezed her hand once, firm, certain, the kind of grip that is not a statement of urgency but of permanence. She held it back with the same weight. They came up out of Penn Station into the spring evening, the city humming around them, people moving in the particular electric way of a city that has remembered it's alive after a long cold season. He flagged a cab and then stopped and looked at her and said, "Or the C train." She looked at him. He said, "It runs through here." She said, "I know." He said, "Wednesday's the regular day." "But." She said, "But." He said, "But I'd like to take it with you tonight." She looked at him standing on 34th Street with the city coming back to itself all around them, this specific, private, deliberately unhurried man who rode a train every Wednesday in memory of his father and kept a folded paper in his wallet and built rooms where people felt they existed and had stood in a coffee shop in November and sat down across from her without being asked because it seemed wasteful to stand. She said, "Which car?" He said, "Second from the front. Far door." She said, "Let's go." They walked to the entrance. He held the door. She went through first. At the bottom of the stairs she looked back and he was right behind her, close, present, here. The train was pulling in. They got on in the second car from the front, far door, and found 2 seats, and the doors closed, and the city moved around them. She put her head on his shoulder. He put his hand over hers on the seat. His father's seat. And the train carried them, ordinary and completely extraordinary, through the lit tunnels under the city that held them both. There are things people say about love and most of them are true in the abstract and useless in the specific. They say it finds you when you stop looking, which is only partly right, because Mara had not stopped looking so much as she had stopped looking in the wrong direction. They say it changes you, which is also only partly right, because what it does, if it's the right kind, is not change you but clarify you, strip away the versions of yourself that were responses to absence until what's left is the one that was always there, waiting to be the full version. She was the full version now. She could feel it in the way she moved through her days, not faster, not more efficient, but more present, more in the room, more here in the way Priya had noticed before Mara had words for it. She was writing better grant applications. She was listening more carefully in meetings. She was noticing things she hadn't had bandwidth for before, not because she'd gained capacity but because she'd stopped spending so much of it on a low-grade vigilance, the monitoring of exits, the half-presence that comes from being not quite sure the floor holds. The floor held. Callum was not a simple person to love. She knew this and did not make it smaller. He worked too much and said so, and they had negotiated that, not resolved it, negotiated it, which was the difference between pretending a thing isn't what it is and deciding how to live alongside it. He called at 7 in the morning because his mind had already been going for 2 hours and he wanted to hear her voice, and she learned to answer with her eyes still partly closed and say, "What did you find?" Because he always found something, some connection or problem or piece of something he was working through, and saying "What did you find?" was the right door into his mind in the early morning. He was learning, incrementally and with effort, to be uncertain out loud, to say, "I don't know yet" instead of presenting her with a decision already made. She was learning to let him be competent without making it an argument about who decided, which was its own work. They were work. They were also ease. She had not known before that those two things could live in the same place without contradiction. He showed her, one evening in April, the paper from his father's wallet. They were at his apartment, the chess game on the low table still mid-play after 4 months because neither of them had remembered to finish it, and she'd asked about the list again the way she occasionally asked about things that mattered to him in the way of things you circle back to because they are worth returning to. He went to his bedroom and came back with the wallet and opened it and unfolded the paper and set it on the table between them. It was worn, the folds soft with years of opening and refolding, the handwriting small and careful in black pen, some words slightly faded, others darker where the pen had pressed harder. She read it slowly. "The name of the street where I grew up. The sound the train makes coming in. My son's voice is on the phone. Coffee too sweet. A bakery at 6 in the morning. Margaret's laugh. The way a calf stands up the first time. The Bronx in summer. The first warm day in April. A thank you from someone who didn't have to say it. People who hold doors. A window with light through it. Places where people feel they exist." She sat with it for a long time. The last line again. The thing his father had written that Callum hadn't understood until he was cleaning out an apartment after grief had stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and then understood so completely that he'd spent 4 years and a significant portion of his foundation's capital building it into stone and glass and high windows and a recording studio for a girl who would grow up to study audio engineering. She said, "He was paying attention his whole life." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "You got that from him." He said, "I hope so." She looked at the list again. She said, "Can I add something?" He looked at her. She said, "To my own version. Not to his. I wouldn't touch his." He said, "What would you add?" She thought about it. She said, "Mara Voss returning a wallet." He said, "That's an answer." She said, "I mean it for my list. That would be on my list of things I'm glad exist. Because of where it went." He was quiet for a moment. He folded the paper carefully and put it back in its sleeve. He said, "My father used to say that the best days are the ones that couldn't have been planned. The ones that started with something ordinary and went somewhere you couldn't have mapped from the beginning." She said, "Wednesday, October 15th. He said, "Yes." She said, "You lost a wallet." He said, I found something better. She looked at him across the low table in the apartment with the unfinished chess game and the one photograph on the wall and the books everywhere open to different pages. She said, I'm going to tell my mother you said that. He said, she'll say good. She said, she'll say it's enough. She says that about the small good things. When something is exactly what it should be, she says, that's enough. Not meaning it's just enough. Meaning it's complete. He said, that's enough. She said, yes. He picked up the chess piece he'd been about to move for 4 months and set it down in the correct place. She looked at the board. She said, that's check. He said, I know. She said, you've known this whole time. He said, I was waiting for the right moment. She moved her king. He looked at the board for a long moment. She said, well. He said, 3 more moves. She said, show me. He showed her. She watched the 3 moves, the inevitability of them, the way each one followed from the last in a chain that had been visible from a long way off to someone who was paying attention. She said, you were always going to win. He said, no. I was always going to arrive here. Winning requires an opponent. You're not that. She said, what am I? He said, the whole point of the game. She looked at him. He was still looking at the board, that quiet self-possession, that specificity, that man who kept his father's words in his pocket and built rooms for people who needed to feel they existed and took the C train on Wednesdays and left a wallet on a seat by the far door on a day he was deciding to change something and let a woman raised by someone who drove 40 minutes for $2 carry it home. She said, Callum. He looked up. She said, I love you. He was still for a moment. Not surprised, exactly. More as though something had arrived that he had been moving toward from a long way off and was simply confirming had come. He said, I know. She said, that's not the response. He said, I know. He set the chess piece down. He looked at her the way he looked at things he had decided were permanent. He said, I love you, Mara. He said, I have since a woman at a coffee shop counter handed me a wallet and I sat down across from you without asking because it seemed wasteful to stand, and you said, can I ask you something, and then asked it anyway. He said, I love you. He said, that's enough. She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it. Pebble, who had followed her over 3 months ago in increments so gradual as to be effectively invisible, appeared from behind the couch and arranged herself between them with the sovereign authority of a creature who had decided this was her territory now. She said, Pebble approves. He said, Pebble is efficient. She said, don't let her hear you say that. She'll like you even more. He looked at the cat. He said, good. Outside his window the city did what it always did, which was everything at once, sirens and music and the low roar of 10 million people living at full speed. Inside, the chess game was finished, the list was folded back in the wallet, and 2 specific, careful, finally uncareful people sat in the late April light and were simply here. In Albany, Carol Voss sent a text to her daughter that said only, well. And Mara looked at it and typed back one word, enough. Carol Voss put her phone down and smiled at no one in particular, which is how she had always done it, the small good things, received quietly and completely, no performance, just the pure acknowledgement that something was exactly as it should be. The first warm day in April. Light through a high window. People who hold doors. A thank you from someone who didn't have to say it. A woman who returned a wallet full of cash, and the man who was glad she did. That's enough.